Welcome to another Faith in Media podcast. It's so good to have with us today Tim Wyatt. Tim, thank you so much for joining our platform here with Christians in Media. How are you today? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've been doing.
Thanks, Carla. It's really great to join you. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Tim, as you say. I'm a freelance religion journalist. I mostly, but not exclusively, write about the church and Christian affairs, but sometimes cover other faiths as well. I've been doing that for about 6 years, mostly working from home, and so I write for a kind of mixture of Christian and kind of secular mainstream newspapers and magazines, some web outlets, and I've recently started doing a few podcasts as well. So I co-host and run 2 podcasts which are part of the Premier network here in the UK. One of those is a kind of ethics focused one with my dad, who is a doctor and a bioethicist. Another one is one I run myself, which is a kind of church news analysis show. I got into this strange world by working for...
I love that the use of the word strange is there. Please unpack that one for us.
Well, so yeah, I have the joy of when people ask me what I do, people seem to be genuinely quite intrigued because you don't come across freelance religion journalists every day of the week. So I got into this strange world by working for a newspaper called The Church Times. Some people might have heard of that. It's quite a long-standing weekly newspaper that covers primarily the Church of England, but again, kind of wider Christian affairs. So I worked there for about 4 years as a news reporter and later did some kind of digital podcasty stuff as well. And that was kind of how I ended up becoming a kind of unintentional specialist in church news in particular, learning all the kind of arcane terminology and the jargon and the structure and the history, which was never really part of the grand kind of career plan. I kind of wanted to be a journalist since I was a teenager.
Wow.
And I fell in love with the idea when I was kind of at school at sixth form doing kind of politics and history and English A-levels, and kind of really enjoyed writing and reading and stuff like that. Did a history degree and then did a kind of postgraduate qualification in journalism, very kind of fast track diploma thing. And I thought I'd just be, a serious, real journalist, not a kind of fake Christian one. And so I went to work and I got my first job at a local newspaper in Kent. In Tunbridge Wells, of all places, a very quiet, sleepy commuter town. Someone told me in my first week, with great disappointment, one of my colleagues, that they hadn't had a murder for 10 years. And
wow, and that is news
that kind
in
of
Tunbridge Wells.
Perverted kind of people who weirdly look forward to bad things happening because it sells papers. But Tunbridge Wells is thankfully a very safe, quiet place. So a lot of my time was spent writing about parking and planning disputes and council rows and stuff like that. But it was a good kind of grounding in journalism. No one was making up the stories for you. You couldn't find them online. You had to get out there, hit the phones, knock on doors, read council agendas, build up a web of contacts. And after about a year of that, I'd kind of had enough and wanted to get back to London. So kind of stumbled accidentally into this job at the Church Times, which ended up kind of setting me on this trajectory towards, again, much to my surprise and shock, specializing as a journalist covering Christianity. So that's my kind of potted history. That's how I got to where I am here.
That's an amazing story. I love that. And what did you find in terms of how contrasting it was to do journalism within, like you said, it was a local town in Tunbridge Wells, and then getting into writing for a faith-based kind of content specific focus? What was that like the shift? Was it similar approach, or was there kind of like a tension between the two?
I think it was a bit of both. So I think I was quite nervous. I have this slightly, this is a bit cheeky, isn't it? But there's this sense I think a lot of us have in the church, which is that if it's a Christian version of something, it's like a slightly rubbish version, So you don't.
Where does this come from? Where does this come from? You are not the first to say that.
But I had this fear in me that I was like, there's real journalism, and then there's Christian journalism, and that's kind of substandard, half, cocked, kind of, non-professional. And so I was quite hesitant at first even to apply for the job because I didn't know anything about the Church Times. But I happened to know the person, a friend of a friend, got to speak to the journalist who was leaving, who was actually going on to become Justin Welby's press officer, and who created the vacancy. And so I spoke to him, and he kind of reassured me that their subject is the church, but it's a credible, serious paper that does rigorous independent journalism. And so actually a lot of the skills I learned both in my kind of training as a journalist and in my job in Tunbridge Wells actually were quite applicable, about how do you interview someone, how do you write a good introduction to a story to make someone actually want to read it? Like, how do you quickly glean the key facts from a press release and that kind of stuff? So it wasn't as different as I feared. But then, of course, when you're working as a local reporter, I did occasionally write. I tried to kind of write about faith. I remember trying to give a bit of a boost to a food bank that was run by some Christians, give them a bit of coverage, because I thought it was a genuine, interesting story. But, it's also nice to kind of promote what the local churches were doing. But 99% of what I was writing about was, not related to faith overtly. And then coming to the Church Times, where every story had, by definition, to have some kind of connection to God or church or the Bible or Christianity. And so that was... there were certainly tensions there, and something I'm still kind of teasing out to this day, I think, as a Christian, as a journalist, but I very much try not to be. I'm not a Christian journalist. I'm a journalist who is a Christian, or a journalist who covers Christianity. There are tensions, from the tiny things of, the Church Times might send me to an event to cover it. And then halfway through the event, because it's a church event, they start praying. And I'm like, as a journalist, do I close my eyes and become a Christian and join in the prayer? Or do I say, actually, my journalistic kind of impartiality, I need to be an observer, not a participant, and I need to keep my eyes open and my notebook ready and cover this prayer rather than pray this prayer? And that's still a little silly kind of micro example of the kind of bigger tension, I think, that exists.
What do you find yourself veering to most in circumstances like that?
If I'm honest, Carla, I veer towards keeping my eyes open. Okay. Which I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do or not. I think maybe it's a case by case, but I do feel that my job is to observe and to report. And if I am participating, then I am in some sense kind of losing my neutral impartiality as a reporter. And it's, sometimes that's a bit silly, and there's plenty, I'm happy to say God bless at the end of an interview to someone if I'm, and not kind of pretend. I don't want to suppress or pretend I'm not a Christian. I clearly bring my faith to the work, but I want to have a level of detachment, a level of detachment which helps me say, I think these are all great people and I love what you're doing, but ultimately I'm not a cheerleader. I'm not here to promote you. I'm here to report. And that is a subtle but important distinction.
And I'm so glad that you raised that, because I think others who navigate this space and also share similar kind of identification like you do, I am a person of faith, but this is my craft, and not the other way round. And how do you define that? It is important to ask those questions for anyone that is up and coming within the media world. Like, what should that look like for me? And what should that look like in terms of, not only do I represent, like, you're never going to, I feel, not be someone of faith who's occupying the spaces that you are, but how does this mean that I determine my steps in terms of the way in which I approach my work? And that's an interesting balance to have. And I'm glad that you raised just what that looks like for you, because others who are up and coming and may come across this conversation will need to ask themselves similar questions, depending on their context as well. When you started writing for the Christian content, did you find that there was a particular story that really got you in terms of, this has become so important to me, and you were like, it's of note in terms of a piece of work that you've really either enjoyed or just stood out as something really important in your career so far?
That's a really interesting question, Carla. I'm going to take an unhelpful podcast moment of dead air to think about that, rather than just blurting out the first thing that comes into my head. I think, it's interesting. I was actually talking about this just last night with my wife, because I'm currently doing a story which I can't really reveal much about, because it's kind of a big secret investigation and it has yet to come to fruition. But it basically involves a lot of misconduct and bad things going on inside one particular part of the church. And I was telling a friend about this, and he said, how are you coping with that, Tim? Are people looking after you? This is some heavy stuff. Yeah. And I was like, it doesn't really affect me. And I was kind of thinking out loud last night, like, is it bad that I spend a lot of my time diving into like the bad stuff that happens in the church, the child abuse and the fraud and the misconduct and the spiritual bullying and the toxicity and the dysfunctional relationships? But it actually doesn't. And I think on reflection, that's actually okay, that it doesn't. I don't feel emotionally sucked into my stories very often, because I think that actually helps me in terms of having that detachment I was talking about, and saying, on one level, as a Christian, I'm gutted that people I look up to, bishops
Yeah.
and vicars and ministers and pastors, keep letting us down, keep
Yeah.
falling into sin, and keep failing us and failing the gospel and not living up to their calling. I'm devastated about that on one level. But on the other level, I'm not surprised, and it doesn't make me, I don't toss and turn at night wrestling with like, oh my gosh, how awful is it that the church is so broken? And partly because I'm desensitized, but partly I think actually that's just my personality, that I'm not a very kind of emotive, over the top person, and things take a while to kind of penetrate in. So there were, even when I started writing about stuff that I did care about, and clearly, writing about something in the church matters more to me than covering, a parking dispute in a suburb of Tunbridge Wells, which might have exercised my time before. I've always been relatively distant or detached from those stories, partly as a choice, I think, because I think that enables me to kind of offer the clearest analysis and kind of understanding, but partly because that's just, I think, the way I am. Maybe one of the reasons I ended up in journalism is that I don't find it too difficult to kind of step back and say, this is what matters, this is what's unimportant, this is what people need to know. But, yeah, that's awful. But, the world is a broken place. And
I think that segues quite beautifully into kind of the question that I wanted to ask you next. How do you manage to balance the work and life element? Because what you're talking about, these things could be incredibly impactful to one who shares. You subscribe to this faith group, you subscribe to this environment, this is part of your own culture, and then to report on such things can be quite deeply impacting. There is definitely a relationship there that you have to engage with. How do you find balancing that with just, I mean, when you're writing what you're writing, with regards to the things that you're writing, that you mentioned some of the most negative things that would be heartbreaking. These are the things that we find are probably some of our biggest challenges as being a Christian in this modern world. It's an age-old thing. It's human frailty. But within these positions of authority and power, it's been abused, or there's, like you said, misconduct. These are the things that deeply impact and wound the body of Christ. How have you been able to actually navigate, keeping not only just your own faith, as you've alluded to, but also like you're still sticking by doing what you're doing, which I don't think is an easy feat to do. So I guess I'm asking, what are the tools being employed here for anyone else that needs to figure that balance out? Because you seem to be doing it, and doing it well. You're still here being a journalist, occupying these spaces.
Yeah, that's, again, a really interesting question. I think there's a couple of things I'd mention there. I think the first one is, quite early on, particularly when I worked at the Church Times, and particularly when I went freelance, I had to kind of work out a kind of theological rationale for why I did what I did. Why am I a Christian and a journalist? My Christianity is not, I'm very important that I'm not a Christian journalist, but I am a journalist who's a Christian, and my Christianity is not kind of separate to my career and profession and craft, as you called it. And I think even more so when, you might hear the kind of rejoinder, well, Tim, why are you writing? Why are you exposing this? The church can't take another child abuse scandal. We can't deal with, why are you drawing attention to, these church leaders who have failed, who've had affairs, or have, lied about things. And my kind of theological rationale has always been that actually the most godly thing to do when people in God's church fall is to shed light on it. Paradoxically, it's not to cover it up, it's not to hide it, but it's to shed light on it, because it's only that way that we can actually build a church that more closely reflects kind of God's heart, God's integrity, God's vision. And so I actually do, in my slightly more pompous moments, believe that what I'm doing is a degree of service and ministry to the church. Paradoxically, I might be, like I mentioned, this big investigation I'm doing is going to reveal some very, very bad things about a very important part of the church. But I do believe that is actually theologically justified, because actually until we bring things into the light, until we tell the truth about what has gone on, even with warts and all, we can't actually say hand on heart that we're following Christ, and we're living under his lordship. And ultimately, what has been most destructive to the mission and ministry of the church in this country is not just the fact that priests have abused children and bishops have done X, Y, and Z, and churches have been spiritually toxic. What has been most damaging is when these things have been covered up.
Yeah.
And then that allows abuse to continue and more victims to be sucked in. That allows for, you know, people who are kind of destructive and abusive to rise up the ladder and become even more powerful. So I do honestly believe in my more pompous moments that Christian journalists and journalism about the church is godly and is ministry and is serving the church by shedding that light, that sunlight, that disinfectant that journalists talk about. So that's kind of that helps me keep going, because I'm like, this might have a short-term negative impact. You know, it might lead to some people saying, reading a story I write and saying, oh my gosh, aren't Christians awful? But I do believe in the long term, you know, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, and that actually
And
over the long term, like the church and God's mission in this world will benefit from scrutiny and from exposure of kind of misconduct. So that helps, I think. And then there's also that, I think, that sense of trying to hold on to the fact that, you know, what excites journalists like me is always bad news. You know, it's never good news. And that's true of all
well, you never
journalists.
tell, because for those that are listening but can't quite see, Tim's face has got a very bright and positive countenance, which is wild that he gets really excited about the negative stuff. It's very interesting to see that, because you're literally lit up in the face as you're talking about, this is what I'm called to do.
Yeah, no, you're right. And this is what goes back to that comment about Tunbridge Wells having no murders, is that by being a journalist, you walk into this world and you let your values get turned upside down, because what you are interested in is bad stuff happening to people. Because what we have learned over hundreds of years of doing journalism is that people don't want to read about good news stories. They want to read about bad news. And so that is why, you know, I don't write ever, you know, a pastor did a good sermon on Sunday and it was really well received and it was really spiritual and it really spoke to people in a powerful way. And actually a couple of people went out for prayer ministry at the end and found themselves really moved by what God was doing, you know, which happens in tens of thousands of churches up and down this country every Sunday. But no one ever writes about that. Why? Because it's not newsworthy. Now that, you know, you could say that's a shame, right? But that's just the way it is. But actually holding on to that fact that I write about the bad stuff, but the bad stuff is only 1%. And the bad stuff needs to be written about. It needs to be brought into the light. Like I said, it needs to be exposed. But actually, you know, for every, you know, minister who has abused a child, there are 999 who are compassionate and caring and take seriously Jesus's warnings about, you know, what you do to these little ones and are working to protect young people and children and do safeguarding well. And none of them get any coverage because no one writes about people who do it right, who get it right. And that, I think, I hold on to that in the back of my head, that I have a very partial and one-sided view of the church because of my job, because of what I spend my time writing about. And that actually it's not representative at all of the millions of believers around the world and in this country who are taking, you know, doing it right, taking it seriously, living out their faith in small, unimpressive, but really godly ways.
How do you find, slightly moving on a little bit further, how do you find working with your dad in terms of bringing this world together, and also his side with regards to medical, the kind of like medical ethics side? How do you find bringing that balance into all that you do as well?
Yeah, that's been, again, a very unexpected kind of part of my portfolio.
This is the most
career.
interesting, isn't it? When it's unexpected.
Yeah.
I like it.
So it kind of came out of the lockdown, really, that he has been he kind of retired as a clinical kind of practicing doctor about 10 years ago, and a bit more than that. And since then he's spent a lot of his time writing and speaking at churches and helping Christians kind of think about, started originally with kind of the medical ethics issues about, you know, abortion and euthanasia and fertility treatment and all these kind of really knotty dilemmas that Christians face, but kind of expanded into, you know, more general stuff about the world of work and about technology and science. So he kind of produced all this material. He was speaking at churches, he's writing books, going to conferences, but he had this idea that actually he's only reaching kind of his generation, and that my generation, you know, millennials, for better or for worse, aren't.
I love how you say that with such a mocking tone. You clearly don't take it seriously. You're like, what is this?
Yeah, well, you know, I am a millennial. I can't deny it. But I take that. Yeah, I think it's always good to have a slight wry smile when we talk about the generations. But millennials are, you know, they're not buying his books. They're not going to the Keswick convention. And so he was like, how can I reach them? And maybe, you know, podcasts. I was like, well, podcasts are what young people listen to. So we had this experiment, just the two of us, very kind of amateurish. We started just talking, and in the lockdown, we stuck at home, nothing else to do. So we started talking online and recording this and just putting it out there, and discovered there was a small but interested audience in that. And then after about a year, to our massive shock and surprise, Premier approached us and said, would you like to bring Matters of Life and Death? I should give it a plug, shouldn't I? I'm not really good at this. Matters of Life and Death, available on all good podcast platforms. Would you like to bring that into the network, and we'll kind of promote it? And we were like, yeah, absolutely, that would be fantastic, So it falls part of their kind of apologetics, unbelievable kind of strand of programming. And that's been great. So and that increased the frequency. So we now do that weekly. So I actually end up spending a lot of my working life on Zoom calls with my dad, which again, unexpected, but it's been a joy, actually. I think what I love about it is that, I've found some way of basically getting someone to pay me to just, shoot the breeze and talk about big ideas, which I would do anyway, with my dad. We're both
That's
kind of,
it's good. If you're willing to do it just for fun, and this is what we love to do, I think they're getting a very convincing, a credible source for someone that's willing to do it that way. But what's like you mentioned with journalism, it's a lot about reporting, not always on I'm not going to say it's overly negative, because you said that before, but actually, and the way that you described it, I really like it. There is a need for justice and truth to be heard. And it's the thing that calls us also always to a standard that is what Christ accepts. Yes, we're about love, and so is Christ, but he's also about what is just, and he's also about what is truth. And that is still a standard where it's a mark that it's been missed and needs to be called into account. And it sounds like for you, that this is part of the vehicle that you carry in enabling that as an expression of what God needs to have happening within his bride and within the body of Christ. Bringing that in with the big questions that your dad covers with regards to like literally issues of life and death in this world, that must be an incredible connection and relation. Do you find, what has been some of the responses to that? Because I imagine with your father's exposure to different generations, none of these questions are new, but they are certainly kind of reacted to or responded to in different ways. And especially, I feel like this generation probably has been the most liberal, should I say, in terms of how we want this to have the main stage. It's not niche, or it's not a section away. Now they've brought it into trying to use it as on our education platforms within, this is what we see in media every single day. This is on our social media. How have you guys found responses to that? Because what you've done is bring two almost worlds together, but still speaking about pertinent issues. What's that been like?
Yeah, I've been really pleased and quite touched by the response. We get emails from people who are saying, I got this diagnosis, my wife is pregnant, and we were told this complicated diagnosis by the doctors, and they're suggesting X, Y, and Z, and like what to do. And, we found someone across this podcast you'd done about, new reproductive technology and how Christians might think about that. And so I think, yeah, it's really, I feel like a bit of a charlatan because I'm not medically trained. I'm just, I'm like one of those people who's got a lot of knowledge, but it's a mile wide and an inch deep, which I think is, part of the job of being a journalist. Whereas, my dad has gone deep on in particular issues and, spends a lot of time reading the studies and, doing all that kind of research. So I do feel like a bit of a fraud, but at least I'm a conduit to get some of the stuff that's inside my dad's head out there in a format that is accessible. So it feels like a real service, a real gift to be able to offer people. It's a confusing world, Carla, isn't it? Like we live in a confusing time. And a lot of what we talk about on the show is about, cutting edge technology, breakthroughs in science and medicine that are raising kind of novel, confusing questions for Christians, about, what do we think about IVF? That's not in the Bible. That's not something that Christians until the 1970s had ever thought about because it wasn't a thing. And, there's a lot of misinformation and we're not preachy. We don't try and be very prescriptive and say, this is what you must do. We're not taking a position of authority, but we're trying to say, here are some principles that you can pull out of the Christian tradition from scripture and from Christian theologians. Here is some hard science facts so you know what you're dealing with. And then we sit back and hold these two things together and say, how do these fit together? And what general principle might we be able to pull out of how Christians have thought about other ethical issues that we could apply to a question around a kind of brand new kind of reproductive technology, for example. So, and I think it is, people are finding it kind of, there's a bit of a niche there. We didn't think there were many people doing that kind of work, certainly here in the UK, who are trying to, stay on top of, we talked a bit about things like AI and like, chatbots and large language
Right.
models.
Right.
How do we feel about that intersecting with spirituality? And, should vicars start getting ChatGPT to help write their sermons? Is that all right? Can the spirit
Yeah.
move through software and, stuff like that? Questions that, again, people haven't been answering, but I think haven't been talking about before, but I think will become more and more pertinent. So I hope it's more about giving people a bit of a framework and a foundation, maybe just giving them more questions to ask rather than giving them answers, but saying, if you weren't aware of, like, AI software is going to be a big thing in the next 5 years,
Yes.
and you
Yes.
need to start wrapping your head around it now, because too often our kind of great bemoaning is that the church has been so reactive and so late to join the dots on some of these things that we either completely miss the boat, or we allow ourselves just to be dictated to by the culture, and we just say, well, this is what everyone else is saying, I guess that's right. And what we would love is for there to be a generation of believers who are actually at the cutting edge of some of these developments and these confusing new things going on in the world, and saying, actually, we're not always reacting to, but we can actually start to chart out a distinctively kind of authentically Christian approach to some whatever issue it is, rather than waiting 20 years until it's a done deal and then furiously scrabbling around trying to pick and choose what the culture is shoving down our throat.
I think it's amazing. And for me personally, I'm so grateful that yourself and your dad have actually chosen to avail yourself to create a platform where these conversations are being had, because it is, like you said, it's a very confusing world, and it's rapidly changing. I think if I look at just my parents' generation, probably closer to your dad's generation as well, it's kind of considering that actually life, the generation before theirs, wasn't too dissimilar. It really kind of had similar tempo, similar almost expectations in terms of a person's aspiration. And then all of a sudden, within a very short space of time, I think the changes happen so rapidly. Almost every single year, we've seen a different development, whether it's in language, and whether it's in people trying to find ways of identification, and also other moves that have taken different thrust in terms of now this is at the forefront, where these issues have been kind of going on for a long time. But now for the first time, they're welcome to the main stage. But now we're suspicious of it because we're not sure if this is another political agenda. All these sorts of things are always happening. And I love that you've described that yourself and your dad have created a form. Like, we're going to be the people that make sure that the church is not going to be seen as irrelevant, or the fact that we're not in the know. And that, I think, more of that needs to happen. More of that needs to be, like, as a church, we need to be we're not embracing to become like the world, but we need to understand what's happening, so that there's a way in which for us to communicate with this world, to still make sure that those that are caught in this abyss of madness, looking for answers, we at least have the language to communicate ways out and other alternatives and other options. And for me, it's actually really encouraging and inspiring to hear that your dad being moved by, like, I have something, help me, my son, to bring me through. And so that we can get this message out, because it's still humans. It's still the unique issues in terms of people are trying to find safety. They're trying to find identity. They're trying to find purpose. Difficult to do, I think, in a world that's going in 1,000 directions all at the same time. And the gospel has always been an answer, but how do you communicate that when a generation is changing in so many different ways? I guess this leads really well into my next question, in terms of from when you started your journey with journalism into journalism now, and you've mentioned in terms of this whole influx of AI and technology, have you noticed a huge change in how this world has developed for you?
I think it's clearly been a massive kind of era of flux. I often, again, slightly tongue in cheek, tell people that I was kind of born 50 years late, because I read about what journalism was like in the kind of second half of the 20th century. And in many ways, it seems like a bit of a golden age. I once saw a picture of my paper of the staff of my old paper in Tunbridge Wells. They'd all gathered in like 1971 in the car park of the old office to do a picture. And it's like over 100 people,
Oh, wow.
And when I was there were 5 reporters, a news editor, an editor. All the sub-editors had been contracted out. They were in Wales somewhere. There was a receptionist, and I think that was about it, And I just remember feeling this huge nostalgia for a world that kind of has come and gone, when journalism was this kind of, and newspapers in particular were this kind of culture shaping force, and they sold in their millions, and there was loads of money to send journalists around the world and to cover the real stories. And I've done whereas I've come of age as a journalist post the kind of .com revolution, which has really gutted the media, as people will know, in terms of numbers of journalists who can be afforded, and circulation of physical newspapers is plummeting through the floor. And the internet isn't, even though it's lots of hits, it's not replicating that in terms of money. And so I basically feel like my entire decade of journalism, God, it's actually 10 years this year since I became a journalist.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. I only just realized that the anniversary passed me by. It was in January. My decade in journalism has basically seen the kind of endless dead ends of people trying to resurrect and come up with a new funding model. And instead, we've just seen, when I used to do shift work sometimes for the Independent, and I would be expected to write upwards of 7 or 8 stories in a 9-hour shift. And in the olden days,
wow.
When the Independent was started in the 1980s, the reporters there might write 1 story a week. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the pressures and the strains and how the industry has shifted, and it's so overworked and understaffed that I think it's easy for kind of morale to be low. And so I think I've seen a huge kind of ongoing decline in kind of confidence. I have friends who I trained with who kind of burned out of journalism within 5 years and are now in PR or in comms because there was just a much more stable, secure income and livelihood. Part of the reason I went freelance was because I was ready to move on from the Church Times, and I was struggled to find a kind of full-time gig elsewhere. And I'm really glad I did for lots of other reasons now, and it's actually worked out really well, and God has been really faithful and blessed me with a kind of mostly steady stream of work of different ways. But it was a bit of an experiment because there just wasn't that many proper kind of jobs to move on to. So it's certainly a challenging time to be a journalist, and that probably will ramp up even more when AI starts to take over and kill even more jobs, and we'll become kind of content managers and things like that rather than actual reporters. So I don't look with huge enthusiasm about some of the future, but at the same time, I think what I'm encouraged by is that at its heart, I don't really believe journalism has changed from the era, my grandparents' era, when people were writing on typewriters and sending reports by telegram. Like, I think the fundamentals of what inspires me to be a journalist and the vision and the values that shape it don't really change, even as the technology and the headcount and the finances might fall away. So I'm a bit of a unusually sentimental about that in that sense. I used to have this amazing quote on my top of my Twitter profile, which I read in an obituary about this great Washington Post editor, and it's this kind of like clarion call about just tell the truth and let the consequences be damned. Or your job as a journalist is just to find out the truth and tell other people. And I was like, yeah, I can get on board with that. That inspires me, that excites me. And I think that remains the same, even if in 2050 it's just a bunch of underpaid teenagers as interns. Still the job is the same.
I love that.
The job is the same. Find the truth and tell it as well as you can.
Well, I love that. It's just been an incredible conversation, and thank you so much for sharing both your story and also just, for me, it sounds like you're someone that is motivated, and I feel very kind of like gifted to and called to a place that occupies a space that it kind of is precarious, it's uncertain, but yet you find yourself still very solid there, which is amazing. And I guess, Mike, to kind of close our conversation, I would ask you what form of advice would you leave for other up and coming young journalists who are looking to navigate the space? Yours is quite unique. You've been able to balance between secular and Christian environments with this. And you've been quite definite in terms of, I've been able to make sure that my identity is solid, my craft and my excellence is still maintained. It is a reflective of where I come from with my faith, but it doesn't determine it or stop me or hinder me in any shape or form. What kind of advice would you be able to offer young people trying to where do I go from here? What steps do I take? Especially as you've just described, this world is so changing.
I think one of the things that the first thing comes to mind is this is a really kind of hackneyed, cliched piece of advice from to kind of young people going into a career, but it is true, I think, which is that find a passion. And in journalism in particular, I think find a beat. We sometimes use that language, don't we? A niche, a field. My one ended up being the church, as I said, unexpected, slightly unwanted, But actually now I'm really pleased that I have a specialist subject that I am genuinely specialist in, and something that I actually care about. There's a part of me that wishes I was a sports reporter and I was going to Arsenal football games for money, but in reality, that is slightly vacuous. Whereas whatever I write about the church is, it's not vacuous. It's not unimportant. This is the institution that carries the gospel over generations. This is God's vehicle for transformation in the world. Like, when it's doing it well or when it's doing it bad, it's not unimportant. And so I do feel passionate about, probably, most likely, who knows the future, but spending the rest of my career, however long it is, focusing on writing about the church. And it doesn't have to be the church, if your passion is sports journalism, like, go for it. But what I would say is, you're not going to get very far if all you have is a kind of vague, inchoate sense of, being a journalist might be all right. Like, particularly now, to make it work, you need to have something that inspires you, that makes you get out of bed in the morning and do all the rubbish bits, the invoicing and the scheduling of your social media posts and the editing of your headlines and all the rubbish bits, because you say the other half is not just a job but is actually a passion of mine. And I think you're not going to get very far if you haven't found that. So and it took me a while to find it. I'm not saying, you need to sit there, wait until the perfect job in your exact niche. That's not how the world works. And you might have to take a more general reporting job or start at a local paper like I did, or do something else. But always be asking yourself, what makes me come alive? What excites me? What do I find myself drawn to reading about anyway, even when it's not relevant to my career? I always couldn't stop reading about X, Y, and Z, and do what you can to end up there, because that, I think, is when you find yourself with a genuinely, and that's where I've been able to meld, is that I am interested and fascinated with the church, but also there's only about 5 people in the country who write freelance religion journalism. And so I can honestly say, without being arrogant, I'm one of the country's experts on church affairs. And that means that I have a niche, so I have a skill to sell. I can, make money, put food on the table. And I think if you can find those two and dovetail those two, that's really precious. So it might take a while. You might have to circle around and bounce from thing to thing, but always be circling and aiming to find somewhere where your passion can dovetail with something that's actually going to, make a living for you.
Tim, this has been incredible. I feel like my eyes have been opened on things I never even considered. I feel incredibly inspired. I know others who come across this conversation will as well. And also, it's just lovely to kind of encounter someone that is your living frontline reality. Your ministry is not, I think traditionally speaking, sometimes we have this association that ministry is something that happens exclusively within the church walls. You've yet brought the church walls very much to a world stage or a platform that, because of your skill and your desire to see excellence and truth kind of have a stand and have a visibility, but also motivated by compassion because you want to see the body of Christ grow well, is just such an inspiring thing to see and to hear from your perspective. So thank you so much for sharing that today. It's been an absolute honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla. I really enjoyed our conversation.